10 Hollywood icons who taught us love but were violent to their wives. Good evening. My name is Jack Sterling. For a lifetime, I held a job title that never appeared on a single tax return. I made the difficulties disappear. I didn't bury bodies in the desert or burn evidence in a furnace. My specialty was far more surgical. I made reputations glow while the truth underneath turned to ash. I worked for the Titans, MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount. When their leading men had a lapse in character at home, they called me. When the neighbors heard the screaming, I was there before the police could even find their pens. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about 10 men who taught America how to love on the big screen and taught their wives how to fear in the dark.
He was a liar! He was a liar!
The Champion's Fist, Wallace Beery. Let's start with the worst of the lot, Wallace Beery. In 1931, the world gave this man an Oscar for playing the champ, the ultimate father who would die for his son. But while America was weeping in the theaters, I was standing in a hospital hallway, paying a doctor to hide what Beery had done to a 17-year-old girl. We sold you a hero. He gave her a funeral for an unborn child. Back in 1917, Beery was 31 and married to the rising star Gloria Swanson, who was only 17. During an argument, Beery went into a rage and Gloria directly in the stomach. She was 3 months pregnant. Within hours, she missed. It was a son. How did the studio handle it? Paramount didn't call the police, they called us. We handed Gloria $50,000, enough to buy 3 mansions in Beverly Hills back then, in exchange for a signed non-disclosure agreement. The brutal assault was sanitized into a tragic medical complication for the morning papers. The irony? For the next decade, Beery became the highest-paid actor in Hollywood, playing gentle giants and protectors. He stood on that Oscar stage thanking the fans who believed in him, while Gloria Swanson remained childless for the rest of her life. She only dared to tell the truth in her autobiography at age 81, long after Beery was buried. That's how the playbook works. We didn't fix the man, we just fixed what you saw. Just kidding, but believe me, the blood on the studio's checkbook is much harder to wash off than the makeup on a movie set. You want to know how the playbook works? It's simple. You don't lie to the police. You just give them a reason to look at their bank accounts instead of the evidence. We paid the doctor to call a punch to the stomach physiological stress. We paid the police to remember Mr. Beery's generous donations to their fund. And we paid Gloria $50,000 to sign a piece of paper that traded her child for a Beverly Hills lifestyle. The beautiful irony? 5 years later, we handed that monster a golden statue for playing the world's best father. America cheered, and I went home and washed the blood off the studio's checkbook. That's a successful campaign. Think about that for a second. We didn't fix the man, we just fixed what you saw. And as long as you believed he was the champ, none of you cared that his wife was burying a child in the dark. That's the Hollywood magic. Selling you a hero built on a grave and making you pay for the privilege. Rex Harrison. Next, let's talk about a true gentleman, Rex Harrison. That cultured voice and perfect diction made him a star, eventually winning an Oscar for playing Professor Higgins in My Fair Lady. He spent that movie teaching a flower girl how to speak properly. Too bad he never learned how to call for help. In 1948, Harrison was having a messy affair with actress Carol Landis. On Independence Day, after Rex told her he'd never leave his wife, Carol took an overdose. Rex found her on the bathroom floor. She was still breathing. Now, pay attention, because this is where the gentleman becomes a fixer's client. Rex didn't call an ambulance. He didn't try CPR. Instead, he called his agent. Then he called the head of publicity at 20th Century Fox. For 45 minutes, while Carol lay dying on that cold floor, Rex and the studio handlers discussed how to save his career. Rex snuck out the back entrance at 3:45 p.m. Only then did the studio call the police, claiming a random friend found her. By the time the sirens arrived, Carol was gone. We suppressed the suicide, fed the papers a story about a depressed starlet, and photographed Rex at the funeral wearing dark glasses as the grieving friend. The punchline? In 1964, Rex stood on the Oscar stage and thanked all the wonderful women who had taught him so much. I suppose Carol taught him that in Hollywood, 45 minutes is just enough time to rewrite a tragedy into a clean exit. I'm kidding. But in this town, a leading man's reputation is always worth more than a mistress's life. Beery was a brute, but Rex was an artist. While Carol Landis was taking her final shallow breaths on that bathroom floor, Rex wasn't praying. He was on the phone with his agent. We had a 45-minute window before the body got cold to coordinate the story. A window where he chose his career over her life. We turned a suicide into a troubled starlet's depression and a guilty lover into a grieving friend in dark glasses. Sir Rex played the part so perfectly that even the coroner didn't dare to point a finger. That's the beauty of English manners. They make even a neglected death look like a polite exit. Think about that 45-minute delay. In Hollywood, that's just enough time to fix a script. But it's an eternity for a woman waiting for an ambulance that was never called. We taught you that as long as a man has perfect diction and a well-tailored suit, you'll forgive him for letting the woman he loved die on the floor. After all, it's not murder if it's handled with good manners, right? Bing Crosby. Now we come to America's dad. The man who sang us to sleep every Christmas while his own children lived in a waking nightmare. Bing Crosby wasn't just a singer. He was the definition of the American dream. He won an Oscar for playing a gentle priest in Going My Way and sold 50 million copies of White Christmas. To the public, he was wholesome, safe, and the ultimate father figure. But in 1983, his eldest son Gary published a memoir that shattered the halo we had spent decades polishing. Behind the gates of his Holmby Hills estate, Bing was a tyrant. He instituted a ritual every Saturday, the weigh-in. If his sons had gained even a single pound, they were punished. And Bing didn't just use a belt, he used a custom-made one. According to Gary, Bing had inserted pellets, lead or steel, into the leather. It was a tool designed to maximize pain while minimizing visible bruising. After all, you can't have the kids showing up to a studio photo shoot with marks on their legs. The damage Bing left behind wasn't just physical. Two of his sons, Dennis and Lindsay, eventually took their own both leaving notes that traced their despair back to their father. Gary himself died estranged from Hollywood for daring to tell the truth. As a fixer, I can tell you, we knew. We saw the fear in those boys' eyes, but we chose the lullaby. We protected the saint because the brand was too profitable to fail. Even today, when December rolls around, the world still plays his records. We choose to hear the angel's voice and ignore the sound of a lead belt. In this town, if you sing sweet enough, the world will let you get away with anything. We all knew. The agents, the publicists, the neighbors, everyone in Hollywood knew Bing was a tyrant behind those Holmby Hills gates. But you don't kill the goose that lays the White Christmas eggs. When a teacher called about suspicious marks on the boys, we called it old-fashioned discipline. When his wife Dixie called me in tears, I didn't offer a shoulder, I offered a threat. I told her that exposing Bing would destroy her children's futures. I made her feel like the villain for wanting the truth. I personally oversaw the full-page Christmas ads. The happy Crosby family, all sweaters and smiles, wishing you peace. I made enough money from those lies to buy a beautiful house in Pasadena. Now, every December, my neighbors play his records, and I have to sit there listening to the man who beat his kids with lead-tipped leather while the world calls him a saint. That's the Hollywood formula. If a man's voice is profitable enough, his violence becomes character. We sold you a father figure while he was busy making his own sons want to disappear. You got the lullabies, They got the metal-tipped belt. And the most successful part of the lie? You're probably still going to play that song this December, aren't you? The system. You're wondering how they got away with it. Simple. We didn't run a movie business. We ran a sanitized reality. From 1930 to 1960, the studios didn't just hire actors. They owned inventory. They chose your name, your dates, and even the brand of integrity you wore to dinner parties. If an asset broke, an arrest, a scream in the night, a bruised wife, we didn't call for help. They called me. We bought cops, silences, and doctors' signatures like we were buying props for a Western. We weren't protecting men. We were protecting the box office. If you found out your heroes were monsters, the dream would die, and the cash would stop flowing. So we lied. We lied so perfectly that the fiction became your history. Bing was a saint because we printed the halo. Rex was a gentleman because we tailored the suit. We gave you the icons you wanted, so you'd keep buying the tickets I needed. Now, let's talk about a man who required a very special kind of maintenance. A man with the voice of an angel and the temper of a mob boss. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra. Working for Frank Sinatra wasn't about polishing a halo. It was about fire insurance. To the world, he was the voice, the man who sang My Way and made every woman in the room feel like the only one on earth. But to those of us behind the scenes, Frank was a man with the soul of a poet and the temper of a mob boss. And it's those friends in the mafia, men like Sam Giancana, that made his outbursts truly terrifying. When Frank lost it, you weren't just dealing with a singer, you were dealing with the shadow of the underworld. His marriage to Ava Gardner was a volcanic mess of booze, jealousy, and violence. Ava would later admit, "Frank hit me," but she lived in the fear of who he knew. The breaking point came in 1953 at his compound in Palm Springs. Neighbors heard screaming, glass shattering, and finally, a gunshot. When the police arrived, the house was a wreck, and Ava was locked in a bedroom. Frank, drunk and pacing, claimed he just fired into the air out of frustration. My job was to make sure the missing bullet didn't turn into a prison sentence. We massaged the reports into a domestic disturbance and fed the press stories about their passionate, fiery love. We used the word passion to bury the word violence. Frank went on to win Oscars and sing for presidents, and when he died, they lit the Empire State Building in blue. It's the ultimate Hollywood magic trick. If you have enough talent and the right friends, a gunshot in the middle of the night just becomes part of your legend. I suppose when you're the chairman of the board, you don't just sing My Way. You make the law look the other way too. Working for Frank wasn't about polishing a halo like we did for Bing. It was about fire insurance. When a gunshot echoed through Palm Springs in '53, we didn't call the law. We called the family. You don't read Frank his rights. You offer the police chief a front row seat at the Sands in Vegas. We fixed neighbors' fences and donated to their churches until they suddenly developed hearing problems regarding the screaming. We flooded the press with stories of his heart of gold to drown out the sound of breaking glass. And the mob? They were the silent partners in every room. The kind of insurance policy that ensured victims didn't just stay quiet, they stayed terrified. We sold you the voice, but we kept the muzzle for ourselves. That wasn't publicity management. It was survival in a tuxedo. Think about the irony. We turned a man who fired bullets into his own walls into the romantic icon you played at your wedding. We taught you to swoon over the passion while we buried the aggression. In Frank's world, talent didn't just excuse the crime, it bought the immunity. As long as he hit the high notes on stage, you were more than happy to ignore the bruises he left backstage. After all, nobody wants to argue with a man who has friends in low places, right? Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy was known as the moral conscience of Hollywood, a man of integrity who played judges and priests. But off-screen, that integrity was drowned in whiskey. He remained legally married to his wife Louise for 44 years because of his Catholic beliefs, even though they lived apart for 34 of them. The truth was, Spencer was a violent alcoholic. He didn't just drink. He disappeared for weeks on binges and smashed furniture in fits of psychological terror. Then there was Katharine Hepburn. We sold you their 26-year affair as the greatest love story of the century. But for Kate, it was more like a 26-year prison sentence. She wasn't just his co-star, she was his full-time caretaker. She spent her life hiding his car keys and making excuses for his illnesses while living in fear of his next rage. Friends watched her age prematurely, developing tremors in her hands from the stress of walking on eggshells. When he died at Kate's house, we orchestrated the final performance. The legal wife sat in the front row at the funeral, and Kate sat in the back. The New York Times called him a model of dignity and restraint. I suppose if you can hide the broken glass and the bruises on a woman's spirit, the world will still call you a saint. It's the ultimate acting job, playing a man of honor while you're busy being a monster in a tuxedo. I spent 19 years on the Tracy account, longer than most of his co-stars' marriages lasted. We weren't protecting a soul, we were protecting a balance sheet. When Spencer vanished on a 2-week binge in Mexico, I told the press he was polishing a screenplay in private. When he terrorized Katharine Hepburn in the middle of the night, she'd call me with the code. Spencer's had a difficult night. I never asked for details, I just sent the florist. MGM needed their moral conscience to stay upright just long enough to win another Oscar. So we rebranded his liver failure as exhaustion and his domestic violence as temperament. We even sold his adultery as the greatest love story of the century because he was too sincere a Catholic to get a divorce. It's the ultimate Hollywood magic trick. We took a violent drunk and sold him back to you as a priest and a judge. We knew he was a nightmare, but you needed him to be a saint. So we kept the bottle hidden behind the altar. As long as he looked like America's conscience on screen, who cared if he was a monster at home? After all, it's not a crime if the actor is distinguished, right? Desi Arnaz. Managing the Arnaz marriage wasn't publicity. It was corporate risk management. On screen, he was Ricky Ricardo, the charming husband with a conga drum and a funny catchphrase. Off-screen, Desi was a chronic alcoholic and a serial adulterer who didn't even try to hide his tracks. When he drank, the harmless temper you saw on TV turned into real-world violence, screaming, breaking furniture, and terrorizing the household. While 60 million Americans laughed at their antics every Monday night, Lucille Ball, the CEO of a multi-million-dollar empire, was locking herself in her own bathroom, waiting for her husband to pass out so she could feel safe. Why did she stay for 20 years? Because they weren't just a couple. They were a factory called Desilu. Divorcing Desi meant killing the show, the business, and the perfect American image that paid our salaries. She waited until the very last episode was filmed before filing for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. She kept him as a business partner for years, but the romance was a ghost. When he finally died, Lucy called him a great showman and a great friend. Notice she never called him a great husband. In Hollywood, we'd rather let a woman live in fear for 2 decades than ruin a profitable laugh track. Managing the Arnaz marriage wasn't publicity. It was corporate risk management. They weren't just a couple. They were a factory called Desilu that employed half of Hollywood. If they split, the checks stopped clearing. So when Desi had his monthly affair, we didn't call a lawyer. We called the girls and reminded them that destroying Lucy was a sin America wouldn't forgive. When Desi threw a chair through a window in '57, I didn't call the police. I told the press they were renovating. We paid off the gardeners and bought the cops with front row tickets to tapings. The most bitter pill? Lucille Ball was the boss. She was the CEO who chose to keep the man who terrified her on the payroll because the brand was worth more than her safety. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was the ultimate swashbuckling hero, the man who saved damsels in distress. But in 1942, the damsels weren't being rescued. They were in a courtroom accusing him of statute rape. Two teenagers, ages 16 and 17. Under California law, consent didn't matter. It was a felony. But Warner Brothers didn't just hire lawyers, they hired character assassins. We didn't defend Errol. We put those girls on trial. We whispered promiscuous and gold digger into every reporter's ear until the jury stopped looking at Flynn's crime and started judging the victim's morality. It worked. When he was acquitted, women in the courtroom cheered like he'd just saved the kingdom. That's where the phrase, "in like Flynn," really comes from. It's not just about being a ladies' man, it's about getting away with a crime because you look good with a sword. Errol spent the rest of his life as a violent drunk, terrorizing his wives and expressing zero regrets. We turned a predator into a bad boy icon because he was a multi-million-dollar asset. In this town, justice isn't blind. It's just easily distracted by a charming smile and a studio's checkbook. The 1942 trial wasn't a legal defense. It was a masterclass in character assassination. I didn't run that show. Warner Brothers had their own team. But we all studied it like a holy text. The strategy was simple. Don't defend the man, put the teenage girls on trial instead. We whispered promiscuous and money-hungry into every reporter's ear until the jury stopped asking if Errol was guilty and started asking if the girls were good enough to deserve justice. We had fan clubs screaming, "We believe Errol!" outside the courthouse and flooded the papers with stories of his war relief work. It worked perfectly. Errol was a multi-million-dollar asset. Those girls were just collateral damage. We didn't just win an acquittal. We turned a predator into a hero and a crime into a punchline. Next time you use the phrase "in like Flynn" to describe getting away with something easily, remember where it came from. You've been celebrating a statutory rape acquittal in your everyday speech for decades without even realizing it. That's the ultimate fixer's victory, turning a felony into a catchphrase. In Hollywood, as long as you look good with a sword, we can make sure the law never touches you. It's not about the truth. It's about who's too valuable to be guilty, right? George Sanders. George Sanders was a different breed of monster. He didn't need a fist to leave a mark. He used a polished Oxford accent to dismantle a woman's soul. He won an Oscar for playing the cynical critic in All About Eve, but his greatest performance was the 5 years he spent emotionally shredding his wife, Zsa Zsa Gabor. George didn't shout or throw chairs. He was a master of the 1,000 small cuts. He would calmly criticize Zsa Zsa's accent, her intelligence, and her looks, often in front of a room full of people. The most devious part? He was so sophisticated that everyone thought his cruelty was just wit. While he was destroying her self-esteem, the guests were laughing, and Zsa Zsa had to laugh along. She called it 5 years of psychological torture. He never raised a hand because his words did the job much more efficiently. After a 32-day marriage to Zsa Zsa's sister, who also cited extreme cruelty, George for good in a Spanish hotel in 1972. He left a suicide saying he was bored with this sweet cesspool of a world. It was his final act of intellectual superiority. He spent his life making women feel microscopic, only to prove that he was too refined to live among the rest of us. In Hollywood, if your insults are grammatically correct, we don't call it abuse. We call it charm. But a cage is still a cage, even if it's built out of perfect diction. George Sanders was a different breed of monster. He didn't break bones. He dismantled spirits with surgical precision. For a fixer, he was a dream. No blood on the rug, no police reports to bury, just a wife's self-esteem shredded into confetti. He used that polished Oxford accent to turn 1,000 small cuts into what the world mistook for sophisticated wit. When he checked out in a Spanish hotel in '72, he claimed he was bored. Even his suicide was a final performance of intellectual superiority. He couldn't admit he was a hollow, broken man. He had to frame it as being too refined for this sweet cesspool of an existence. He spent his life making women feel microscopic, only to find out at the end that he was the smallest man in the room. John Barrymore. John Barrymore was royalty. Born into the most prestigious acting dynasty in America, he was the man they called the Great Profile. His face was a masterpiece, his talent was legendary, and his performance as Hamlet set the gold standard for a generation. But behind that perfect silhouette was a man dissolving in a sea of whiskey. By the time he married his fourth wife, Elaine Barry, John was 54 and the rot had set in. Elaine was only 20. What should have been a dream marriage to a legend became a chaotic nightmare. John wasn't just a drunk. He was a paranoid, functional wreck who could put away entire bottles of scotch in a single sitting. When the liquor took over, John developed a strange, violent obsession with mirrors. He would stand before them, watching his once beautiful face bloat and decay in real time, and then he would explode. He'd smash every mirror in the house into jagged shards before turning that same rage on Elaine. She described nights spent fleeing their home in terror, hiding at friends' houses while the Great Profile roared at the walls. By the late 1930s, the industry had had enough. The man who once dominated Broadway couldn't remember a single line of dialogue. He showed up to sets so drunk he had to be propped up. We couldn't hide the decay anymore. The legend had become a cautionary tale. John Barrymore died in 1942, officially of organ failure. In reality, he'd been drinking himself to death for 40 years. We spent decades selling you the prestige of the Barrymore name, while Elaine was busy dodging flying glass and the ghost of a man who couldn't stand his own reflection. In Hollywood, we'll keep a great profile on a pedestal long after the man behind it has crumbled into dust. By the late 30s, John wasn't a star anymore. He was a controlled demolition. You can't hide a man passing out on a live radio broadcast. So we stopped lying about the bottle and started romanticizing the rot. We rebranded a violent drunk as a tortured genius and compared his benders to a Shakespearean tragedy. We sold the public a distinguished suffering so they wouldn't look too closely at the bruises he left on his young wife. John smashed every mirror in his house because he couldn't stand the sight of the ghost he'd become. But the studio? We kept the mirrors intact for you. We kept showing you the Great Profile long after the man behind it had dissolved into whiskey and rage. We preserved the illusion while the reality rotted behind locked doors. Think about the strategy here. We turned his addiction into a symptom of his greatness so you'd keep buying the myth. We gave you a legend to mourn while his wife was busy dodging shards of glass. In Hollywood, we'd rather let a man die in a room full of broken mirrors than let a great profile go to waste. After all, a legend doesn't have to be a good man. He just has to look good on a pedestal, right? James Mason. Finally, let's talk about a man who proves that you don't need a whiskey bottle or a clenched fist to be a monster. James Mason was the pinnacle of British sophistication, precise, controlled, and intensely talented. But inside his home, that controlled intensity was used as a weapon to suffocate his wife, Pamela Colino, for 23 years. James didn't leave bruises you could photograph. His abuse was surgical, financial, and psychological. He controlled every cent in the house. Pamela had to beg for money for basic necessities and present receipts like a suspect under interrogation. If he didn't like a purchase, he didn't yell. He simply withdrew into a freezing, calculated silence that could last for days, leaving her drowning in a sea of unexplained guilt. He ran their home like a high-security prison. He decided who she could see, where she could go, and even what she was allowed to say in public. Friends called their marriage warfare, but it was a one-sided siege. James was a master of the reasonable insult. He'd dismantle her confidence with cutting remarks about her looks or her mind, always delivered with the calm, cultured tone of a gentleman just making an observation. When they finally divorced in 1964, James's lawyers didn't just fight for his money. They tried to erase her entire existence, arguing she had contributed nothing to their 2 decades together. We kept the press focused on the expensive settlement and his distinguished career, making sure the word abuse never touched the headlines. Because in Hollywood, as long as you use a silver spoon instead of a fist, the world will call it particular rather than cruel. James Mason worked until the day he died, a respected icon, leaving behind a victim whose only scars were on the inside. James Mason was a different kind of nightmare because technically he was a perfect gentleman. No fists, no mistresses, no drunken scenes for me to clean up. He didn't break her skin, he just suffocated her spirit for 23 years in what she called a prison of perfect manners. In 1964, my best PR strategy was simply to say nothing. We didn't deny her claims of psychological cruelty, we just let them hang in the air until they withered. Without a black eye or a broken bone to show a jury, the public simply looked the other way. We helped James play the reasonable man while his wife was living in a freezer of his making. He worked until the day he died, a respected icon, because we knew that in this world, if you can't see the bruise, people will assume it doesn't exist. Think about the danger of decency. We taught the world that as long as a man is articulate and exacting, he's not an abuser, he's just particular. James Mason got away with everything because he never made a headline. He didn't destroy her body, he just made her life uninhabitable, one polite silence at a time. It's the ultimate invisible crime. The world won't believe in a monster who uses a silver spoon instead of a fist, right? The end. I've reached the final line of my own dark ledger. Don't bother looking for an obituary with my name on it. A man who spent his life erasing the footprints of others knows better than to leave his own. The truth is, Hollywood's golden age was built on a foundation of muffled screams. Those breathtaking films you adore, those classic ballads that make you weep, they were forged in a system that pampered monsters and sacrificed women and children just to keep the gears of the money machine greased. I was a vital part of that engine. Don't offer me forgiveness. I haven't offered it to myself. Every time you hear White Christmas this December, remember the rhythm of Bing's lead-tipped belt. Every time you watch Spencer Tracy's Integrity on screen, remember Hepburn's 26 years of terror. Those men weren't punished. They were gifted with Oscars and immortality. My name is Jack Sterling. I was the fixer. I protected the predators and crushed the ones who dared to speak. I did it for the money, I was damn good at it, and now I'm just an old ghost paying off his debt to the truth. If you want to keep digging through Hollywood's dirty laundry with me, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It's the only way to ensure the studio lawyers don't find me before I finish telling you everything. Just kidding. Though in this town, the truth is usually the most dangerous thing you can own. Good night, and I'm sorry for ruining the dream.